Subtropical Storm Nicole will be heading westward tomorrow and Wednesday for the Florida East Coast. Hurricane watches are up for much of the east coast of Florida, and we have hurricane warnings up for the Northern Bahamas. We'll be talking about Nicole and the longer-term impacts. What happens after it goes to Florida? Is that moisture bound for the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast, or more broadly up the eastern seaboard? Meanwhile, today was the last day of record highs in the Northeast, and much cooler air will be moving in for the next few days. We've got a big rain and snowstorm going out in the west, and this too has a part in this drama that we're setting up for later this week. All that and so much more, including a kind of nice, cold, long range. All of that on the Joe and Joe Weather Show, brought to you by Omni True Value Hardware at 1226 North Wellwood Avenue in West Babylon, New York, in Southwest Suffolk County on Long Island. It's your go-to hardware store to get everything you need to make sure your home can stand up to adverse weather and that you are protected. And that might mean you need a new generator, you need some new flashlights. You still might want to get your yard looking okay while the autumn lasts, which is not for much longer, with mulch and topsoil. And of course, with winter coming, we're talking rock salt and snow plows and snow blowers. You name it, they got it. 631-756-1125. Best prices in town, if not anywhere. And the website is
OmniTrueValue.com. Hello, Joe.
And hello, Joe. And here we are tonight on the Joe and Joe Weather Show. Good evening, everybody on the chat board. Good evening to all of you who are new to the Joe and Joe Weather Show tonight, as we watch to see how subtropical storm Nicole evolves as it makes its way toward the east coast of Florida. Hope everybody had a nice weekend. And if you're new to the Joe and Joe Show, hit the subscribe button and make sure you turn your notifications on, because Joe and I will be probably on every day for the rest of this week. We're usually on Monday through Thursdays at 7:35, Sundays at 11 a.m., but we might be on Friday this week, Mr. Rayo, depending on how this all plays out. But subtropical storm Nicole, what really makes this sort of intriguing from a forecast standpoint is that big high that's coming down to the north, because that is really going to be a player here in a number of ways. And most importantly, in terms of its impact, this is going to be one of those storms, if people are focusing on where the center is and where the landfall is, that's a mistake here, because with that big high pressing down, especially along the immediate coast, I think we're going to see impacts right up at least to coastal North Carolina, with the coastal flooding and beach erosion and gales that'll probably develop over the course of time over the next day or so.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that the storm, according to the Hurricane Center, Joe, may very well reach hurricane intensity, but if it does, it's going to be for a very, very short interval of time. When it's just off the Florida coastline late Wednesday or Wednesday night, then it comes on shore, and of course then the winds get knocked on down again. Right now it's a subtropical storm, which means that it's not a warm core system. Actually, the center of the storm is actually more cold than warm, but with time, especially over the relatively warm waters of the ocean, it may begin to warm enough so that it will transition into a full-fledged tropical system. And then when we get to later Wednesday and Wednesday night, briefly, perhaps a Cat 1 hurricane. And there are hurricane watches posted up and down the Florida coast. Now, my question is, and it has not yet they have not made a decision, is whether or not the moon rocket that they are due to launch on late Sunday night, the Artemis moon rocket, which has already been delayed several times, whether or not, because of the potential of major winds and rains, will be moved back into the vehicle assembly building and kept there until after the storm. It'll be interesting to see what decisions NASA makes with that. But in the meantime, kind of crazy that we're dealing with all of this in the normally chilly month of November. And another record high today for many locations, including right here in the Hudson Valley and White Plains, where it got to 75 degrees at Westchester Airport this afternoon.
Newark got to 80.
Wow.
Amazing. And I believe 79 at MacArthur Airport on Long Island
Now
for the
that's pretty
high.
interesting. I mean, you'd expect Long Island wouldn't get so, but then again, we had the cold front. The cold front came through here in the Hudson Valley between 10 and 11 o'clock this morning. The winds immediately revved up out of the northwest and gusted to over 20 miles an hour. And again, in such situations, a westerly wind, the westerly component of the wind actually helps. It didn't cool things off any. The west wind coming on down the lee side of the Appalachians, compression effects actually for a few hours helped to warm the atmosphere, and that's why we had such amazing temperatures: 70s, mid 70s, upper 70s. You just said, Joe, 80 degrees at Newark, 79 in Islip. Just an amazing, and this may not be the end of the. I mean, it may be the end of the 70s, but after a 48-hour cool down coming up, we may see temperatures again rise back up into the 60s to near 70 by the end of the week.
Right, but that's because the atmosphere is going to be priming up for Nicole ahead of the next cold front, which is different from the setup that we had. It's not going to be nice weather, mostly nice weather like we just had the last 3 days in eastern Pennsylvania to southern New England, with the exception of the showers that were around yesterday. This is going to be the atmosphere priming up for getting the coastal corridor basically tropically primed, let's say,
Right,
in
right.
order so that you're going to see Nicole, whether it comes up with the core intact or whether it somehow gets absorbed by the frontal system and you get all the moisture to come up. It doesn't matter. It does look like we're in for maybe some significant rain at the end of the week. Our resident hurricane statistician Anthony Orr sent this to me today, and this is courtesy of Colorado State University Philip Klotzbach. Okay. And this particular stat: subtropical storm Nicole is the third Atlantic named storm to form since Halloween. Along with Lisa and Martin, it is the most Atlantic named storms to form between October 31st and November 7th on record. So we had three named storms form in that 7-day period for the first time ever in I think this may even go before the satellite era. So this goes probably all the way back to the 1800s where they have records. So yeah, pretty remarkable. I mean, it's certainly, you could say, I think fairly, that this late season activity certainly makes up for the lack of activity in the month of August. And why don't we go to the I'll go to this first. We'll go to the U.S. satellite loop first, so we can at least put this in perspective with Nicole on the right and me in the picture, who I'm now, I'm removing myself from that picture. But you can see Nicole on the right, and it does not, it does have a subtropical look to it, although, and I'll go close up in a moment, there are thunderstorms that are starting to develop closer to the center. And I think this is something to watch overnight and into tomorrow morning. Right now, it looks like a very large amorphous system there that's out there with clouds pushed up offshore, but still offshore at the latitude of east central North Carolina. But we'll probably, if this is going to make a transition to a purely tropical cyclone, which is what the Hurricane Center expects, you're going to see these thunderstorms cluster up more near where the center is. And in the meantime, it's quiet in the Northeast and in the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast. There's not much going on at all, and even down in Florida, other than some patchy clouds. You can also see out in the West. This is going to be the other player. We have a rather large potent storm coming into California, and that is going to be bringing, and already is bringing, some heavy rains and heavy snows in parts of the northwestern U.S., and that weather system is going to bring the cold front that sets up the alleyway for Nicole late this week after it moves inland in Florida.
Well, that big storm that you just referred to, Joe, is going to be bringing, by the time we get to later tomorrow evening, there's going to be at least a foot or more of new snow across the Sierra Nevada mountains from that adorn the eastern border of California. I mean, there's going to be a pretty darn significant snowfall for them for early in the season. And you're absolutely right. That storm is eventually going to become a part of this whole regime for later in the week, pushing a front in our direction here in the eastern United States and allowing some of the moisture streaming northward from Nicole to move up ahead of that front. And it looks like, if you take into account both the GFS and also the European model, you could say that we could have 12 full hours of moderate to heavy rainfall from about midnight on Friday night to about noontime on Saturday. And then, if all goes according to schedule, then we will have storm system move quickly and take a lot of that moisture out of the area during Saturday afternoon. And I wouldn't be surprised if on Saturday in the afternoon hours, we actually saw some sunshine breaking through
All right.
after a rather wet overnight into early on Saturday morning.
All right, so let's take this along its path of what it looks like now and what Nicole will do going forward. And I've got this close-up loop going here, and on the last frames before the sun sets on the visible, you can actually see the center mostly exposed at the very bottom of that southernmost cluster of bright white clouds and thunderstorms. However, in the frames that have occurred since then, you can see the development of convection going on. It's not balled up yet. There are breaks, obviously. It's not balled up yet, but we are seeing the convection beginning to expand. And this is going to be key overnight into tomorrow morning as this system continues to move away from this sort of hybrid cold core / warm core system that it is to something purely warm core. And the reason why among several reasons why that it's important is if it's a warm core system, you're going to see the strongest winds tighten up closer to the center. So this is obviously going to have implications for the folks that are going to be near that center regarding landfall. However, as I said earlier, this is a little bit of a different scenario because of the fact that you're going to have this big high that is setting up in upstate New York and northern New England. And what I'm drawing here, these red lines. So if this is Nicole, so I'll put an L there. You're going to see a very tight pressure gradient develop well to the north of where the storm actually is. This is not going to be one of these instances where if you're 70 or 80 miles or 100 miles away from the center, you're not going to really experience very much along the immediate coast. I conceivably could see gales spreading well north of where they otherwise would be. And I think even more importantly is the fact that this easterly fetch, Joe, coming at the time of a full moon, which is overnight tonight, we're going to have peak tides in another day or two while this is approaching land. This, I think, could mean for some serious coastal flooding issues. And in fact, if we'll take a look at it when it comes time, the Hurricane Center storm surge forecast of a 3 to 5 foot storm surge extends pretty far up the coast. A lot further up the coast than you would normally see from a hurricane that was making landfall, say, in August or September, where it's less likely to have a really strong dome of high pressure to the north like we're having this time around.
Well, I think it's going to be pretty much for us, excuse me, more of an east or southeasterly component of the wind when they're at their worst, and that would be again probably sometime on Friday as the storm itself. The storm center will be down over South Carolina late Friday and Friday evening, and yet, as you pointed out, Joe, because of the strength of that high, and that high looks like it's going to go rolling right off of the northeast coastline out into the almost like the middle of the Atlantic. And so the combination of the gradient from Nicole and that offshore high will produce some rather strong and gusty winds, again, mostly from a southeast or maybe even a southerly direction when the storm is at its worst here. And that will be for, it looks like, sometime in the overnight hours, late overnight hours of Saturday night, Friday night into early on Saturday morning. And we could pick up quite a bit out of this. I mean, there are some places that will be in line for at least 2, maybe even 3 inches. And when that all comes down very quickly and very hard, that could create some flooding issues. And that would be, again, for Friday night into early on Saturday.
And by the way, the difference with respect to the gradient that I just described, that's actually set for the Carolinas and points southward. That is actually setting up to, starting tomorrow. Whereas for areas north of there, particularly if you go from the Delmarva Peninsula north and east to southern New England, we really don't have too much to worry about that until the storm has already made landfall and is starting to make the turn up the eastern seaboard. So we're talking maybe Thursday night and particularly Friday and Friday night. It's not like we're having a 2 or 3 days of northeast and east winds to start piling water onto the coast. This is a different scenario for the areas to the north than it is for the areas that are well to the south, down in the South Atlantic states. Now, at 7 p.m. on the Hurricane Center's advisory at 26.7 north, 70.8 west. So that would put it probably about roughly 600 or so miles east of Miami Beach. Top winds are 45 miles an hour, still moving northwest at 8, but it's going to be turning more westerly as we move into Tuesday. You can see the Hurricane Center has the red areas in the Northwest Bahamas all under a hurricane warning. The hurricane watch goes from Hallandale Beach in Florida, which is north of Miami, up to the Volusia, Brevard County line. Well up the coast. You see tropical storm watches are posted north of there into southeast Georgia to about Savannah. Nothing posted yet further to the north. But again, I just want to go back to some of the other graphics that the Hurricane Center's putting up here. The surge, where is the surge? Hang on, I'm just trying to find one of the maps here. Well, let's go with the potential rainfall. So this is from WPC. So this is valid through Thursday, 7 p.m. So there's more on top of this afterwards. But you can see they're going, there's nothing going on rain-wise now, obviously, and probably not tomorrow either. But this will be for Wednesday, particularly Wednesday night and Thursday. We're looking for areas of the yellow of 4 to 6 inches, and also up further to the north, up the coast, in and around the Orlando area, which, by the way, that same area got clobbered with foot-plus rainfalls from Ian. So this part of Florida certainly won't be any stranger to heavy rainfalls, even with a hurricane or a possible Category 1 hurricane that could go inland well to their south. This is also going to be different for the west coast of Florida. We should emphasize that this is not the same thing that's going on, what happened with Ian coming in from the south. From the southeast, the southwest, is a whole different ball game as opposed to something coming in from the east. So you're not having to worry about a huge piling of water into areas around Fort Myers or Tampa Bay from as far as tidal flooding is concerned. It's more that's all that part of it is going to be for the east coast of Florida. Let's go with that surge map. So here you have, this is the peak storm surge forecast, which the Hurricane Center's put out. And I mean, this is a very, very long line that goes all the way up into southeast Georgia to Altamaha Sound. I hope I said that right. So that's on the Georgia side. But they're talking about peak storm surges here of 3 to as much as 5 feet. It's the fact that if you get a storm, let's just say it goes inland somewhere near North Palm Beach, which is one of the towns that's marked off here on the map. you're talking about the potential for 3 feet or higher storm surge going almost 300 miles further to the north. And that's the result of that northeast, that tight pressure gradient that sets up 2 days before landfall, and that persistent northeast to east wind. Put the full moon on top of that, and you're gonna have some serious coastal flooding, potentially serious coastal flooding problems here.
Absolutely, and beach erosion and the like. And again, we point out, even though the moon officially turns full tomorrow morning, and also undergoes a total eclipse, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the show. Um, there is always a tidal lag of about 1 or even 2 days, depending upon the topography, depending upon where you're located along the Atlantic coast. The highest or absolute highest tides rarely ever coincide with the full moon. The astronomically high tides come about a day or two later, and that's bad news. That unfortunately is going to be right about the same time that Nicole will be doing her worst in terms of, well, as I said, later in the day on Wednesday or Wednesday night, coming inland as possibly a Cat 1 hurricane going across the central Florida peninsula, maybe making its way out over the easternmost section of the Gulf of Mexico on the other side of Florida. But regardless, that's going to be the worst time right there, later on Wednesday into Wednesday night, maybe early Thursday. And that's also when we're going to be seeing the highest or most absolute highest tides from the effect of the full moon.
So the hurricane intensity guidance, and I just hit the refresh button, and we have the new 0Z guidance is in. You can thank being on standard time for this, folks.
Yes, yes.
So in the next 48 hours, let's say 48 hours from now, we're talking about Wednesday evening. So none of the models, two of them, okay, I'll give you two of them, bring it right up to the line of a Category 1 hurricane. The rest of them are all in the zone of tropical storm. And if you follow the way the intensity plots are, they start to decline. Now, this would imply this is probably when Nicole is crossing the Florida peninsula, and it is forecast to briefly maybe come out on the other side, or perhaps barely come out of the other side. Then you see most of the models just kind of keeping it as a mid-level tropical storm. So this probably suggests to me that they match up with forecast tracks that are moving up along or just inland of the coast of Georgia and the Carolinas, going down the road at the end of the week. The two exceptions may be these two models, particularly one that strengthens it out to a Category 2. I think that probably is a model that the land track is more offshore, coming off the Florida coast or coming off the Georgia coast perhaps, and then running out further offshore. Now, I would just point out that as this goes further north, we're going to see it probably become more post-tropical in nature, which means that the heavy rains are going to shift to the west side of the low track, and the stronger winds will be on the eastern side of the low track. And when we talk about our local weather a little later on, we'll get into that a little bit more. This is the GEFS or the GFS ensembles from late this afternoon. And the one thing I did notice, Joe, that more members are a little bit more north and west on this run. But if you follow the mean course, it's just literally just barely offshore Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and then runs just south to about 39 and 70, 38 and a half, 39 and 70, with a number of them taking the low through what we call the box. And some of them to the left of the benchmark. And that may have implications in terms of the rain. And there are some members, by the way, that are even much further west than that. And the hurricane track model guidance. Now, this is the 18Z. So I'm pretty sure when I hit the refresh button, we'll get the 12Z. And there were, for the first time, we're seeing a couple of tracks that are actually further west, going up in eastern North Carolina, southeast Virginia, and then passing right along the New Jersey shore, cutting across Long Island and into southeastern New England. So let's look at the new ones, if they're in, and they are. So we actually have even a couple of more that are further west now. So it'll be interesting to see. More importantly, first things first is Florida, and you see how they're all clustered there. Somewhere north of Miami, maybe north of Fort Lauderdale, somewhere south of, say, Melbourne. So somewhere in there for a landfall, and then a bunch of them take it across the peninsula, briefly into the northeast Gulf around or just west of Tampa, then turning it back and turning it sharply northeastward. And that's when that cold front comes into play, Joe. That cold front, the speed of that cold front coming eastward is going to be really critical here in terms of how soon Nicole makes that turn more northward and then northeastward. And does it does it absorb Nicole into the frontal system? Does Nicole maintain an identifiable core as it moves up? Because that could make a big difference in terms of the rainfalls. It could make a very big difference in some places if that core were to remain intact as it moved up the coast.
And Ross Niederman, by the way, a few minutes ago, when you were talking about that one model run, that one particular model that was strengthening it up to a Category 2, Ross Niederman on the chat board said, "Not Cat 2," and with 3 emojis with tears being shed. So unlike other individuals who are rooting probably for a major hurricane and wishing that the darn thing would come straight up the coast and straight at them, there are others on this chat board, and I guess Ross is one of them, that said, no, please, don't let that happen. But I think you're right, Joe. It's important to point out that whatever we do see in terms of precipitation and possibly heavy precipitation on Friday into early Saturday is not necessarily going to be caused so much by Nicole, but more by the weather front, the cold front that is going to be latching onto Nicole. And actually, it's kind of a meteorological squeeze play, if you will, squeezing or drawing that moisture, that tropical moisture, up along the eastern seaboard out ahead of that front. And then the front will actually serve to shut it off like a gigantic spigot being turned early on Saturday morning to put an end to the precipitation and hopefully even allow for some sunshine to develop by Saturday afternoon. And of course, I know, and you know too, that all of the local news stations up here are probably going to say the same thing. Rain is coming. Nicole, what is Nicole going to bring us? And again, yeah, indirectly it's going to be Nicole, but I think it's going to be more a function of the cold front as opposed to Nicole, again, acting like a gigantic whisk broom and squeezing and sweeping all of that moisture over us and then out to sea to our east during the overnight hours of Friday night into early Saturday.
Yeah, still a lot of variables here. There's a ton of variables here that we have to figure out, and I want to run through just a couple of models while I have them up, and then what we can do, Joe, is you wanted to talk about the lunar eclipse, so you could maybe do that, and then when you're done, we can come back and talk about the potential impacts of Nicole further up the shoreline.
Right. Okay.
Okay. So we could do it that we
Sure.
could do that. So let's hang on. I just got to get the graphic up back again. And there you go. So I'm going to start with this is the dayside European run. Now a couple of things for the folks that are watching that are in the southeast and in Florida. You can already see these isobars are just kind of, from South Carolina on southward, producing some northeasterly winds down off the southeast coast and down into Florida. But, it's nothing really extraordinary at the moment. Nicole is somewhere out here. This was the map from earlier today, by the way. The other thing to point out, and I think, again, is the more important feature, is this big high. And it's not so it's big in terms of the amount of geography it's covering, but also in terms of the pressure. That's a 1038 millibar high, which is a rather strong area of high pressure. And if you watch what happens from, say, southeast Virginia southward, you're going to see these isobars get all crunched together as that high begins to build north of Lake Huron and starts to push further east and south. And the gradient gets really, really tight. I mean, look at this fetch here It starts out from south of Nova Scotia, Joe, and goes all the way down. I'm following one isobar that basically runs from south of western Nova Scotia all the way down into northern Florida. I mean, this is wind and the piling of water into the shoreline coming into that full moon tonight and the peak tides in the day or two that follow. When that tide goes out, it's fighting this northeast gradient starting tomorrow. This is tomorrow afternoon. Nicole is still well away from the coastline here. It's not even close to the Florida coastline here. It's got another 36 hours or so at least before it gets to the coast of Florida. So we're talking about several tide cycles here, possibly four high low, possibly 3 full cycles of tides before the storm actually reaches the coastline. None of that water that comes in with each passing high tide is going to go out. So it's just going to just continue to pile on. And here we have the European, which took it over the northern Bahamas. It gets it down to about a 990 low, and you got to be careful with this because what we don't know is sometimes, conditions are favorable for development here. If it transitions over to a tropical cyclone fast enough, we could be dealing with something that's actually a little bit stronger. The intensity guidance is not reflecting that, but it's not impossible here. And then you see it. This is Thursday, early Thursday morning, 1 a.m. that we have the center on the European, right on the coast. I would get somewhere between, say, Melbourne and Fort Lauderdale. And then from here, we see it actually cross the peninsula on a northwest coast, coming out just north of Tampa, and then straddling the Big Bend of Florida, and then finding its way into southeast Georgia. With the map you're looking at now, this last frame here is Friday morning at 7 a.m. So you see Nicole. Whoops, let me get this out of here for a second. Clean it up. So here's Nicole. Okay. Here's that cold front. So so essentially, this is if I was to draw the upper air over this, you're going to have this south-southwest flow developing that Nicole is getting caught in, and it winds up riding up to the northeast from here. So this is Friday morning. The European measurable rainfall is just about into Maryland and into West Virginia, and setting up for areas further north. So at this point, what we're going to do is Joe Rayo is going to talk about tonight's full moon and lunar eclipse. While he's doing that, I'm going to set up some other maps, and we'll go forward from there. So you, sir, have the floor from this point on.
Okay, I'm trying to figure out why I'm not able to bring. All right, hold on for just a second because I'm just.
Oh, we should say, by the way, that the chairman hitting Super Chat tonight.
Oh, I see.
By the way, Super Chat from the chairman. And there might be somebody else that may have hit Super Chat. Thank you, Scott. The Scott saying Mother Briller's not feeling 100%. So we send her our best. By all means. Hopefully she'll feel a little better, feeling a little arthritic. And I don't see the other Super Chat hit, unfortunately. So whoever it was, thank you so very much for hitting Super Chat. Now, Mr. Rayo's got the lunar eclipse.
If we can't find it, maybe whoever did hit Super Chats before can just come back and say, I was the guy or I was the gal who did it. So anyway.
That would work.
Let me get this now. Is everybody seeing that? Are you seeing this, Joe? This is the standard diagram to what is going to happen in our celestial regime here tomorrow morning. You see the sun up top. Here is us, the Earth, and the Earth is casting a dark conical shadow out into space. Now that dark shadow cone extends outward for about 900,000 miles. Now, at the distance where the moon happens to be, 250,000 miles away. The diameter of the shadow is about 5,800 miles in width. And the moon is only about 2,100 miles wide. So as you can see, there's no problem whatsoever when the alignment is pretty much precise. And that's what it's going to be tomorrow morning. And no problem to get the moon completely immersed into the shadow of the Earth. And here is a composite, if you will. And it's a great composite because it actually shows you the shape of the shadow. Here's one side of the shadow, and here's the other side. And it's obvious that it is a circle of darkness. Now, the moon, of course, does not shine on its own. It shines by way of reflected sunlight. So you would think that when the moon moves into the shadow of the Earth, that it will go completely black and we won't see it for a while when it's in the shadow. And yet, as you plainly see here, what do we got? We've got, and the moon would be moving in this case from right to left or from west to east in its orbit around the Earth. What happens? The moon actually changes color and actually during totality glows with a ruddy or coppery color. Why is that? Why is it? It's supposed to be blacked out. With no sunlight striking it, it's supposed to be invisible. And yet here it is glowing with this reddish coloration. And the reason is simple. When the sun is high into the sky, we see a blue color in the sky. That's because sunlight is taking a much shorter path to reach you, to reach your eyes. Short wavelength leans toward the blue end of the spectrum. The spectrum, of course, is the sunlight is broken into all colors of the rainbow. But when the moon or the sun, when the sun is down low, either when it's rising or when it's setting, the rays of the sun are taking a longer path to reach your eyes. So those longer wavelengths actually trend more toward yellow and orange and red, and that's why at sunrise and sunset we see these beautiful orange and red colors. Well, if you're looking up into the sky tomorrow morning when the eclipse is taking place, when from here on the Earth, we're looking at a total eclipse of the moon. But if you were on the surface of the moon at that time and looking up at the sky, you would be seeing a total eclipse of the sun because the Earth is going to come between the sun and the moon. And so when the Earth, which, by the way, because it's 4 times bigger than the moon, appears in the sky from the moon, 4 times bigger than the full moon does for us, the Earth looks like a big black plate coming in front of the sun. And when they're exactly aligned and when the sun is completely behind the Earth, what happens? What happens is that you see the Earth is ringed by a brilliant orange or ruddy colored ring all the way around the Earth, the dark disk of the Earth. And what is that? That's the atmosphere. And of course, without the atmosphere, we wouldn't be here. But aside from that, the Earth is being backlit by the light of the sun, and the atmosphere is allowing us to see that red ring. The same red that we see at sunrise and sunset now is being refracted or bent like a lens into the shadow of the Earth. And that red light, that orange light, ends up falling upon the moon when the moon moves through the shadow of the Earth. And that's why during totality, we see not a completely black or dark moon, we see a red or orange or coppery colored moon during the total eclipse. And unlike during a total eclipse of the sun, to see a total eclipse of the sun, you have to be along a very narrow path traced out by the shadow of the moon. When the shadow of the moon lands on the Earth for an eclipse of the sun, it is whittled on down to maybe nothing more than 50 or 100-mile wide blotch. And as that blotch travels across the surface of the Earth, if you're along the path of that blotch, the path of totality, you see a total eclipse. But everybody else sees a partial eclipse. Not so tonight with the lunar eclipse, because the lunar eclipse, the total phase of the lunar eclipse, will be visible everywhere where the moon happens to be above the horizon. And that means all parts of the dark side of the Earth. So wherever it's dark on this planet when the eclipse is taking place, that is the zone of totality that you will be able to view it from. And it turns out that when we include all the areas of the Earth that will be turned toward the moon during the eclipse, and we'll show you that in just a moment, I often tell people this is almost like when you go into a movie theater. Pretend, if you will, that the screen, the movie screen, is the moon, and the movie is going to be the shadow, the play of shadows across the disk of the moon. And we here on the Earth, along with everybody else on the night side of the Earth, are in the auditorium or in the theater watching all of this. For example, in this analogy, if the screen is the moon and when the projection starts the movie, that's the show. And meanwhile, down here in the audience, we could say this person is Mexico City, this person is Quebec City, this is Houston, Texas, this is New York. All of these areas in the theater, all of these seats could represent various places on the dark part of the Earth, looking up at the sky and looking up at the screen or looking up at the moon for the eclipse of the moon. And the eclipse is going to be occurring in the wee hours of the morning. Actually, not really all that early. I mean, my goodness, the polls tomorrow for the election will be opening up at 6 a.m. A lot of people, Joe and I used to work the morning shift on television and radio, so we know there are a lot of people up at 4, 5, 6 a.m. commuting to work at that early hour. This is going to happen for those who are up in the hours just before sunrise, November the 8th, tomorrow morning, from 5:16 to 6:41 a.m. That will be the time when the moon will be in total eclipse. 85 minutes of totality, a rather long stretch for a lunar eclipse. Most lunar eclipses, total eclipses last like 40 or 50 minutes. This one's going to be 85 because the moon plunges more directly closer to the center of the Earth's shadow. This is the view of how the moon is going to track through the shadow tomorrow morning. This is in universal or Greenwich time. So for Eastern time, you have to subtract 5 hours off of this. So that means that the partial eclipse, that's when the moon touches the dark umbra. There are two shadows. There's a light shadow called the penumbra. You really don't see much of that. It's not until the moon touches the dark central shadow, the umbra, that you begin to see darkness falling across the disk of the moon. That'll start at 4:09 in the morning. Then as the moon gradually moves into the shadow, more and more of it will be covered up. Total eclipse will begin at 5:16. Middle of the eclipse will be almost at 6 o'clock, 1 minute before 6. Notice, if you will, at 6 o'clock in the morning, the very bottom of the moon will be actually right over the center of the shadow. So likely, if you're up tomorrow morning, the bottom of the moon will be darker than the upper part, which will be nearer to the edge of the shadow. And then after that, it continues to keep on moving through the shadow. It'll be exiting the shadow at 6:42 Eastern Daylight Time. But at 6:42, that's the end of the show for us, because the moon will be setting and the sun will be rising. And so we won't be able to see the latter part of the eclipse as it leaves the shadow, because by then it'll be daylight for us and the moon will be below the horizon. So we will just get to see the first half of the eclipse starting again a little after 4 a.m. tomorrow morning and continuing on through 5 and 6 o'clock, and then ending for us when the moon sets and the sun rises at around 6:42 tomorrow morning. This is the view. If you were on the moon looking up toward the Earth, this is the part of the Earth that will be facing the moon and facing the eclipse at the middle point of the eclipse. The moon will be directly overhead over the middle of the Pacific Ocean, not too far from Hawaii. And notice, if you will, I said that as the Earth turns, it will be coming to an end for us as the sun is rising and the moon is setting. And look at that. Over eastern North America, we're right near the edge of the Earth around this time. And as the Earth continues to turn, eventually we will be taken around the backside of the Earth and we'll lose sight of the shadow. People in the western United States, if they have clear skies, will be able to see the second half of the eclipse, the latter half of the eclipse. We have our friend up in Alaska. If he has clear skies, he will be able to see it. And notice, if you will, here, Eastern Asia, Japan, Australia, Indonesia, these folks will see the eclipse, but they won't be seeing it early in the morning of November the 8th. They will be seeing it in the evening of November the 8th. As the sun is going down and as the moon is coming up, they will be rotating into place to be able to see the eclipse at the beginning of their night on November the 8th, Tuesday, November the 8th. So it's evening here on the left, and it's morning on the right, and somewhere down here, I guess, is the international date line. And so that gives you an idea of, why it's morning here and evening here as the Earth turns. 2.7 billion people, Mr. Sagan, billion, will be able to see the eclipse if it's clear tomorrow morning. And another view of the viewpoint of the eclipse, all parts of the eclipse, the whole eclipse will be visible in this zone right here with the moon at the zenith or directly overhead at the middle of the eclipse. Folks, here in this part of the visibility zone, you'll see the first half of the eclipse, but the moon will be setting either during totality or as the moon is just getting ready to emerge out of the shadow. And meanwhile, the folks here in Asia, Australia, and Indonesia, they will see the eclipse developing as the moon is rising and the sun is setting from their part of the world during the evening of November the 8th. And Joe, we often talk about extremes in terms of temperature. A sharp cold front came through and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in 1 hour. That's nothing compared to being on the moon tonight for the lunar eclipse. This is the crater Copernicus. If an astronaut were standing in the middle of the Copernicus crater, what would he or she experience in terms of temperature? As that shadow comes in to Copernicus and begins to cross over that crater, because the moon doesn't have an atmosphere and can't hold the heat, the temperatures are going to drop very, very quickly, very rapidly. So much so that, for example, when the eclipse begins, when the sun starts getting covered by the Earth at 3:09 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, we will see a temperature on the surface of Copernicus of 266 degrees Fahrenheit, a little bit on the hot side. And then, as the sun gets gradually covered by the Earth, and again, because the moon does not have an atmosphere, when totality starts at Copernicus at 4:29 Eastern Standard Time, the temperature will have dropped to 115 degrees below zero. Look at that. In just over an hour's time, you have a temperature drop of over 400 degrees. And it continues to fall slowly during totality, so that when the sun is about to reappear at 7:03 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Copernicus crater, the temperature has gone all the way down to 146 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. And then during the next hour or so, a rapid climb back upward again as the sun comes back out, and again back to 266 degrees above zero Fahrenheit when the sun is back fully visible as seen from Copernicus crater. A real shockwave. But the interesting thing about that is that here's a picture, an infrared picture of the moon in total eclipse. Even though the surface is very, very cold, we have found that just below the surface, in not all but some areas, it still is very, very hot. For example, here's Copernicus, and there's a hot spot right below the surface, several hundred feet below the crater. If you're on the surface of Copernicus, it's like 150 degrees below zero. But if you go down several hundred feet, it's still very warm. And it shows up on infrared photography as a hot spot, a bright white spot, indicating very warm temperatures below the surface. But again, not over the entire lunar surface. Some areas glow very brightly because it's very warm below the surface. Other areas remain very dark, and some are like bright spots like Copernicus. So it's very interesting what's going to happen tomorrow morning to our friend the moon as it moves through the shadow. And the one final thing that I would want to say about this, Joe, is that during totality, to me, it's always amazing because of the fact that the moon during total eclipse looks almost like it's translucent. When that moon is shining brightly, it looks flat. It looks one-dimensional. It looks like a circular, flat, brilliant, yellowish white spot in the sky. But when the moon is in the shadow, complete totality, the moon suddenly becomes three-dimensional. Now it suddenly looks like a ball or a globe, and it looks like it's being illuminated from within by a red or orange light. And it's almost hanging in the sky almost like a Christmas ball. And again, translucent, if you will. So that makes it a beautiful sight kind of like a model softball, if you will, hanging in our western sky early tomorrow morning around 5 or 5:15. So get on out there, get up, take a look at it. It's the last total eclipse we'll have available to us of the moon until March in the year 2025. And again, the weather looks like it's going to be great for not just here in the Northeast, but for much of the eastern United States. The western United States, unfortunately, as you mentioned at the start of the show, with that big storm coming in from the Pacific coast, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, a lot of those places will be wiped out and won't be able to see any of this because of the Pacific storm. But we here in the East, thanks to that big high pressure system, which we'll interact with Nicole later on in the week, that big clear dry dome of air will provide us with a view tomorrow morning, if you care to get up around 4 or 5 a.m. of one of nature's spectacles, great spectacles, a total eclipse of the moon.
And thank you. That was quite informative. A lot of folks on the chat board they don't want to quiz, Joe. They don't want to quiz. All right, so let me say thank you to Raymond O'Hara, new to the chat board and hitting the super chat tip jar. Also Steve Lapointe hitting super chat and reminding all of you that if you like the Joe and Joe Weather Show, hit the like button because that helps us out. And Joe and I always like it when we get over 100 likes, and we're almost there. Jason Schaefer hitting super chat. Thank you, buddy. Most appreciated. Lou Bond hitting the super chat tip jar. Thank you, Lou. And so has Johnny Quest hitting super chat tonight. So we appreciate the tip jar hits. And again, if you like the show, hit the like button. If you're new to the channel, subscribe and make sure you have your notifications turned on, because this way you won't miss the Joe and Joe Weather Show, which is on Monday through Thursday at 7:35 Eastern Time, Sundays at 11, and this week we'll probably have a Friday night show. So now let's go. Let's go to weather with what's going on in the West, so we could set up everything that will happen later this week with respect to Nicole and how that all plays out. So I'm just going to go back to the U.S. satellite loop here, and we'll start from there. So just give me 1 second. And there you go. Joe, I guess while I'm doing this, pull up CPC's new forecast, the 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day forecast.
I will do that right now.
That. So here we have our satellite loop, and of course you see Nicole on the lower right. On the upper left, you see the rather complex storm system that is coming into the Northwest. You can just take a look at the surface map from late this afternoon. It might have the 0Z maybe out any minute now. But your low is sitting off the coast of Washington and Oregon. You've got this staking stationary boundary, and it's cold on the north side of this. We're seeing temperatures in the 20s and teens, and getting up into Canada, we're seeing temperatures in the single digits. On the other side of it, the stationary boundary, it's not really all that warm on the other side of the boundary either. Temperatures mostly in the 30s and 40s across southern Idaho into Oregon and Nevada. Of course, a little warmer as you get closer to the coast, a little warmer down southern Wyoming and down into Colorado, where temperatures are generally in the 50s. But this is the storm system in the west now that is, of course, you get the other side of the equation. You can see the big high on the surface plot moving into northern Minnesota and beginning to build and push into the east. The cold front is just about to Cape Cod, just into the southern part of the Delmarva Peninsula, southern Virginia, across stationary through Tennessee, and down into Arkansas. The southeast is doing okay. Most temperatures down in South Carolina and Georgia, topping out this afternoon in the low and middle 80s, and even down into Florida, we had temperatures in the 80s. And of course, I'm looking at the wind barbs here along the coast, starting to turn more toward the northeast, and they're really going to pick up in terms of the speed. You're going to see the speeds pick up as that big high begins to build southward. On the radars are quiet pretty much up and down the eastern seaboard. There's a little bit of light shower activity off the Florida south coast and down in the Keys, and also off the coast of northeastern Florida. Nothing really to write home about. It's up in the Dakotas. We've got some precipitation moving through northwestern Minnesota and northeastern North Dakota, and that is just to go back to the surface map to refresh my memory. That is all snow because temperatures there are actually below freezing. And then, of course, you've got this mess that's come in now to the northwest, also down into California. But we've got some bands of showers into central and even into southern California, seeing some showers. And you're seeing some precip up into northern Nevada, southern Idaho, and streaming up into parts of Montana. WPC's liquid precip forecast here over the next 7 days. And this is tonight into tomorrow night. You see there's nothing obviously going on through most of the east. It's all pretty much in the west. But I'm going to jump to the 7-day totals here and show you. Now this is with the result of Nicole. And you can see several to many inches in eastern Florida, southeastern Georgia, coastal South and North Carolina. Also, WPC, is indicating 2-inch plus rainfalls back to northwest New Jersey and into southern New England, with the 1.5-inch line actually going back pretty far west into Pennsylvania. So that's kind of interesting that they have, they've been kind of beefing this up more and more. Also seeing some big precip amounts in the northwestern Great Lakes, and of 2 to 3 inches. Now, on the western side of this, in the Dakotas and in northern Minnesota, that is going to be snow. And the 72-hour probability of at least 2 inches. So this takes us through Thursday evening. Shows a pretty large area of 95 to 100% probability of at least 2, extending into South and North Dakota. I'm going to jump to the 8-inch probability and see what that says. And actually, fairly bullish with the idea of maybe some 8-inch plus snows at southwest North Dakota and northwest South Dakota, and 50% or more. And also in northwestern Wyoming, seeing an area there of 80%, 80 to 90% probability of at least 8. And in the Sierra Nevadas in California, we're seeing a very large area of 80 to 100% probability of at least 8 inches. So why don't we go to 12 and see what we got? We've got a few areas here. Look at that, Joe. Look at that stripe there in California, the Sierra Nevadas.
Right. Right.
It's narrow, but it's in the mountains there. Pretty much an 80% probability of at least 12. And even in South Dakota and North Dakota, in the area in green, that's 20 to 30% probability of at least 12. So that's not a low number with respect to probability of snowfall. So let's go back to the European from earlier. And this is, by the way, this is precip. This is not rain or snow. This map does not show frozen, freezing. It just shows liquid precipitation accumulation, the 3-hour average precipitation rate, okay, in millimeters per hour, by the way. So focus on the low track. So that's where the European sees Nicole Friday morning, somewhere in southern Georgia. And it still has an identifiable low near Charleston or northwest of Charleston by Friday evening. And then it just sort of looks like it gets absorbed by the cold front, which this is Saturday morning. And at this point, the European is faster. It actually brings the rain up the coast, Joe. If you believe the European, rain would be arriving as early as late Friday morning or Friday afternoon in eastern Pennsylvania to southern New England. But it's also faster in getting it out of the way. The back edge would be just about done by Saturday morning, and then it just moves away to the northeast, and it's being replaced by a very cold high that's going to be coming down behind it and spreading into the eastern part of the United States. And this is part of the wholesale pattern change that we're seeing. We've been talking about this, and it appears that Nicole is a very, very important part of this equation as one of the driving forces getting that whole upper air pattern across North America to change into something other than late summer, which is what we've seen recently. But this is a pretty this is a very important weather system in the scope of things, I think. And you see where the European actually has the heaviest rains west of the immediate coast, but it does bring heavy rains to eastern PA, to New Jersey, the Hudson Valley, to Long Island, and to New England as it moves on up. We can look also at the GFS run and take a look at that. Now, here's an interesting development here, and this is what I was talking about, Joe, from earlier. The GFS has now gotten faster and caught on to the idea that it's going to come in a little sooner. It's not quite as fast as the European, but it's getting there. But what I just noticed that's very interesting is it maintains the core here. It's got the core low Saturday morning sitting in eastern North Carolina and then just off the Delaware coast. I mean, that's an identifiable core that survives, that's still there, and it's got a 989 low near Hyannis by Saturday evening. Now, the GFS would suggest that it's about 6 hours slower. So you look at this, and it probably suggests that it rains into early afternoon on Saturday and then gets out of the way. It also would imply that the winds may actually wind up being stronger after the low goes by than ahead of it. But we'll deal with that in the next couple of days. But still, the same idea, because that's followed by another big cold high that comes down behind it, and we're going to be going into a stretch of below normal temperatures that I think is going to last for quite a while. And you have the CPC's forecast on all of this.
Absolutely. And folks, take a look at this. I want especially to point out to you, this zone right here is as high up on the probability scale as you can get. 90 to, wait a minute, let me make sure I didn't miscount here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah. So in this zone right here, where you see the word below, the darkest shade of blue, 90 to 100% probability of below normal temperatures. I wish, Joe, that I had access to the record temperatures for, let's say, Bismarck, North Dakota, or Minneapolis, Minnesota, or Des Moines, Iowa, just to see what the temperatures at this particular time of the year, this would be for the 13th through the 17th of November, what their all-time cold temperatures are for that 4 or 5 day stretch. Because I have a feeling that we're going to be seeing those kind of temperatures in this zone during that period from the 13th to the 17th. Exceedingly cold temperatures, record cold temperatures for this time of the year in this part of the country, the Northern Plains, the Western Great Lakes, the Central Plains states as well, going all the way down to St. Louis and on into Kansas City. 90 to 100% probability of below normal temperatures. No ands, ifs, or buts. But you say to yourself, well, that's pretty interesting. But what about for our part of the world? For our part of the world, actually, we will be below normal, but not excessively so. In fact, up here in the northeastern part of the country, you see near normal for Maine and for a slice of New Hampshire, and then you start trending to below normal across central New England, western sections of New England, New York State, eastern New York State. Notice it gets progressively colder as you go to the west, but while it will be below normal for us, not overly so. I mean, it will be on the order of about 30 to 40 or maybe 40 to 50% probability of below normal temperatures, but nothing to compare with what will be going on out in the central and north central United States. Now, that's for the 6 to 10 day outlook, November 13th through the 17th. Let's take a look at the temperatures for the 8 to 14 day outlook, and things do moderate a little bit. Let's see, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So now what we're talking about is not 90 to 100% probability, but 80 to 90, only 80 to 90% probability. Again, for the northern and part of the Central Plains states, western sections of the Great Lakes. Again, here in the Northeast, we too will be below normal, but just not excessively below normal, not off the wall below normal. 1, 2, 3. So we're going to be in the 40 to 50 or 50 to 60% probability for below normal temperatures. But if you've been hoping for another round of unseasonable warmth like we've just gone through, 3 consecutive record-breaking high temperature days, that doesn't look like it's going to be in the cards for the immediate future. It looks like more often than not, we're going to be looking at below normal temperatures, at least from 6 to 10, and the perspective of the 8 to 14-day temperature outlook. Let me quickly just take a look at the hazards look here and see what do we have. This is the hazards outlook, risk of hazardous temperatures, all hazardly cold, if you will. A high, well, that's not unusual after what we just saw. A high risk across portions of Montana and the Dakotas and into western Minnesota. And it moderates somewhat as you continue southward and eastward. There's a moderate risk here and a slight risk for excessively cold temperatures reaching almost, not quite, but almost to the tri-state New York metropolitan area. Colder, as I said, as you go off to the west. And the other interesting thing to note, you say, so, oh, wow, cold temperatures. What does that mean in terms of snow? Well, it means that if you live across the Great Lakes and also into the Pacific Northwest and the Plain States, near to even below normal probabilities of any kind of precipitation, it does show above normal across Texas and down through Louisiana and portions of Oklahoma. But, here's where the really cold stuff is. And again, just near normal. Not saying it's not going to snow. Near normal, if you have near normal precipitation with those frigidly cold temperatures, there'll probably be some snow over Montana and the Dakotas, although not, terribly heavy amounts of snow, but just, it's snow. And again, dry here in the Ohio Valley, the Great Lakes, and near normal here in the Northeast. And continuing onward to the 8 to 14-day outlook, 15 to the 21st, we're just a few days away from Thanksgiving. Again, near normal, below normal in the Great Lakes area, above normal along the Gulf Coast, and now above normal also in Montana and Wyoming, and also across northern California. So that is what it's looking like for the next couple of weeks, Joe. And I think you were absolutely dead on with your forecast of a big change coming toward the middle part of this month, because indeed, it looks like we're going to be in the ice box, so to speak, as we move on into the next week or two. Again, a much different regime as to what we've been accustomed to these last few weeks.
Well, this broken clock is right twice a day. By the way, if you're a snow lover, especially for this time of year, you kind of want to be, you don't want to be so deep into the cold air. You kind of want to be on the edge of it, because that actually may give you an opportunity. I don't know if it'll show up, but I would not be shocked if we wind up seeing something early. But let's put that aside for a moment. Let's just go back to, I got the wider views. I can show everybody what's going on elsewhere, and you can see the storm that's coming out of the west. Got a very strong low that comes in tomorrow morning right near San Francisco. There's a 998 pressure there, and rain throughout much of the state and the heavy snows in the Sierra Nevadas. Now, that's the low that's going to translate into a storm east of the Rockies. You see it here. On Thursday, you see Nicole on the lower right. The low goes northeast toward Minnesota, moderate to heavy snows in the Dakotas, and up into northwestern Minnesota as that low really wraps up. Probably going to have some winter storm warnings and maybe even some blizzard warnings with that before it's all said and done. But you see how the two sort of work in tandem here. The front coming in from the west, Nicole getting drawn up northward. I'm going to be interesting to see if the GFS is right on the idea of having an identifiable feature. Staying intact as it moves up the coast, because that could make a big difference in terms of the actual weather outcome. You see the first of what will probably be a series of cold highs coming down out of Canada, spreading cold air relative to the time of year. Now, let's remember that over much of the country. You don't often see these 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day outlooks where virtually the entire United States from coast to coast and border to border is below normal. So this is a very cold pattern that is setting up. And on this particular run, we've got a low in the long range, which the prior models were showing. This is a week from now. And, well, let me take a look at this, Joe. Maybe get some snow there in the central Appalachians and maybe up into northeast PA and the Hudson Valley north of 84 and into New England with some sort of deepening low, if that's even real. But I think what is real, regardless, is the fact that there's another cold high that's going to come down behind it. And this one looks even more impressive, spreading cold air just about everywhere and coincides probably with what CPC was putting at that high risk of cold, a 1050 high. That is a big high. Wow. With 504 thicknesses moving into the upper Mississippi Valley. I mean, that's a really impressive cold shot. And I just kind of look down the road. I mean, there's another cold front toward the end of the forecast period that swings into the east and get another one behind that. So you were certainly transitioning over into a colder pattern. And one of the things that's happening is what we're seeing, by the way, we've often talked about with the teleconnections, and I've just pulled up. Now, this is 10 days from now. Let me go back. Let's go 8 days from now, okay? This is what an East Pacific, we talk about the East Pacific Oscillation, among other oscillations and pressure patterns we talk about. I have said many times, and I'll say it again, this, to me, the East Pacific Oscillation is the most important one of those teleconnections that we look at. As far as the rest of them, I'll take my chances on if I'm as a snow lover. But this is the one that is, I think, the most important because it really is the driver of cold air. And here we have, this large area of higher than normal pressures in the Northeast Pacific into Northwest Canada. I mean, they are super high. You also have below normal pressures extending down right along 160, which many of you know when I talk about seeing troughs out there in the Pacific near 160, means that there's going to be a trough somewhere in the eastern part of the United States. And look at where the flow of air is coming from. I mean, it's coming straight from the Arctic region. The only thing that would make this actually colder is if we were to translate this pattern, say, into January or February, or even into the middle or latter part of December. This would be a very impressive. I mean, even for November, I think it's going to be somewhat impressive. But this pattern shows up in December and January. You winter weather lovers will have you'll be jumping for joy out of this. And going forward, you'll notice the vortex in eastern Canada just pretty much stays in control. The west at the end of the forecast period is nothing but ridging. So this is this looks like this will be a prolonged period of colder than normal temperatures that could, at the very least, take us through the end of November. And the other thing I would just point out is if we look at the polar vortex up in the stratosphere, we continue to see a stretching and potential splitting of the polar vortex. In fact, I'm just rolling it backwards. But if we just go through time, starting from today, you get this polar vortex that stretches here in the short term, and then the whole vortex actually plunges down into north central Canada. It gets pretty locked in there, and it's still kind of stretched out. In fact, it actually splits in two at one point here in the next 2 weeks. This is about 12 days from now, and as we've often observed, a stretched out, weak-looking polar vortex like this is something that is favorable for colder air to move into the North America, rather than being up in Siberia, rather than being confined up into the Arctic region. So we have not only we have this negative East Pacific oscillation with these higher than normal pressures up in the Northeast Pacific that's going to be driving a cold pattern, but we're also looking up in the stratosphere for the big gears. And the big gears, Joe, were saying that unlike in past recent years, it is growing more and more likely, I think, that we are going to see an early start to this winter season. And
Well,
you have the upper air up. I'm noticing you have the upper air up here.
yeah, I put the upper air up. I just wanted to explain something about what's coming our way for the upcoming weekend, because we've been saying that Nicole will be working its way or trying to work its way up the coast, latching onto a cold front. And the cold front probably will be moving on through during the day on Saturday. And we've got all that cold air that's out over the plain states behind it. You probably say, okay, as soon as that front comes through the New York area, it's going to start rapidly changing toward colder weather. Yeah, it's going to be changing toward colder weather, but not all at once. Because take a look at the upper air, and you can see that, well, let's say 7 o'clock on Saturday evening. The front has long since passed on through. The assumption would be here that we would have dry weather, maybe some sunshine for Saturday afternoon and clear weather at night. But even though the winds will be probably roaring out of a northwesterly direction, and that is a cold weather wind, take a look at the upper air. The upper air shows that the upper level winds are going to be mostly from the south and west, because the trough is mostly over the central Great Lakes down through the western side of the Ohio Valley. We have to wait the really cold stuff. And this is why, by the way, that the Climate Prediction Center has been showing near 100% probability of below normal temperatures in this zone here. Well, look at the way the winds are blowing, not only from the northwest and north on the surface, but from the northwest in the upper air as well, delivering very cold air that's here and swinging it down around the Dakotas and Minnesota and on into Iowa. For us, yeah, this is why we turn, cold or very chilly, but not excessively so, because we have to wait for this zone, this upper level low, to move on to the east. In fact, let's see what happens as it pivots. It does indeed pivot, but look, still, even as of Sunday, 7 a.m., although again, we may be in a northwest flow at the surface, still coming mostly from a southwesterly direction, because the cold air comes down around underneath that trough through the Kentucky and Virginia and North Carolina area, and then sweeps back up on a southwesterly flow up into our area. Does it ever turn legitimately, or does it ever turn straight out of the northwest? Well, not necessarily. It does come from the west-northwest finally by midday on Sunday. So that's what, really, the coldest air of this upcoming weekend is probably going to have to wait until well after the actual front has moved through during the first part of Saturday. It may not be until the middle or latter part of Sunday that we really begin to feel that very cold air come roaring in on a more of a westerly component or west-northwest component, because up until then, the upper air is more out of a southwest direction. And you see it does eventually turn out of the northwest when we get into early next week. It looks like the coldest air is going to be waiting for us here in the tri-state area sometime later Sunday into the first part of next week on Monday, although it will be turning noticeably chillier on Saturday behind the actual passage of the cold front.
All right. So let me acknowledge we've got two additional hitters of the Super Chat tip jar. We've got Brandon Doherty hitting a Super Chat tonight. Thank you. And Halese Beloy, or I believe if I remember correctly, Zim, hitting a Super Chat. Thank you very much. Most appreciated and very generous. Thank you so much. And thanks very much, by the way, for everybody that's hit the tip jar tonight. Also, 103 likes, so we got over 100, Mr. Rayo. And we're coming up on an hour and a half. And I was just thinking, now that we're back on standard time, not that we're going to do this right now, but this would be the new NAM has already started. So we know it's winter time or getting close to the winter season when we start talking about the fact that we could possibly see the new NAM on a show if we carry it along for another hour. But we're not going to do that tonight.
We're not going to do that tonight.
Not tonight.
Not tonight, yet.
So on that note, I think it's time for us to say goodnight and Thanks everybody for being here, watching us tonight. We will be back tomorrow at 7:35 Eastern Time. So we hope to see you then, and we'll see what happens with Nicole overnight and for tomorrow. If it makes this transition from a subtropical to a tropical system, we'll see how that big high builds down. It sets up that very tight pressure gradient, and that's going to be a very interesting second half of this week. So we're gonna stay on top of this one for sure.
Just quickly on the chat board, Halasi Baloya or Baloy says,
Zim.
Joe Rayo, I have a question. Joe Rayo, I have a question. A few weeks ago, you said October may be cooler than average. Did it end up that way, or did the latter half warm things up? It ended up at Central Park 1 degree, 1 solid degree below normal. It really did start. We did have some really cold weather, but as we headed toward the end of the month, it started to warm things up. Not quite enough to get it up to normal, but it ended up overall 1 big degree below normal at Central Park in October. And so far, Joe, with the first 7 days of November, we are averaging at Central Park 13.7 degrees above normal. I have a feeling. Yeah. I just have a feeling that we're going to chip that down a bit.
That's if the long range is correct, and I have a fairly high confidence that it will be. If the long range is correct, we may not chip away at all of that, but we may actually take it all out and reverse it. It's not impossible. It really isn't. So we've got plenty of time to do it, and I think we have the weather pattern setting up that may just accomplish that. But you have to also sit back and look back at how remarkable, how remarkably warm it actually was this weekend, and certainly hitting 80 degrees in some of the hot spots in early November is highly unusual. But now it goes away, and it probably not to return until sometime next year, we think.
Maybe we'll have 70 degrees in February.
Hey,
after the 2 frigidly cold months of December and January, okay?
You never know. That's what makes weather such a fun subject matter, because you're kept on your toes. Let's put it that way, for much of the year, especially in the wintertime. It makes for a very challenging forecasts and very interesting time. So everybody, we'll see you tomorrow night. Good night, everybody.
Have a good eclipse, everyone.